My name is Robert Crow Dog, and I've served as an investigator with the Oglala Lakota Tribal Police for 15 years. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is true. I have the evidence: photographs, video recordings, soil samples that shouldn't exist, and testimonies from people who died in 1890 but spoke to me last week. Every December 29th at exactly 3:47 a.m., the ground at Wounded Knee bleeds. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. The earth itself opens up and bleeds human blood, fresh and warm, as if 300 bodies are dying all over again. I know because I've documented it every year since 2009, when I first became the officer assigned to what we officially call historical site preservation duty, but what the FBI secretly designates as temporal anomaly management. If you're watching this from anywhere in America, you probably learned about Wounded Knee in school. December 29th, 1890. The 7th Cavalry surrounded a camp of Lakota people at Wounded Knee Creek. They were trying to disarm them, afraid of the ghost dance movement that promised to make the white settlers disappear and return the buffalo. A deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote refused to give up his rifle. He'd paid good money for it, and he didn't understand the soldiers' commands. In the struggle, a shot was fired. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The soldiers opened fire with their Hotchkiss guns, artillery pieces that could fire explosive shells at a rate of 1 per second. They killed men, women, children, infants. Some were hunted down miles from the camp as they tried to flee. The official count was 150 dead Lakota, though our oral histories say it was closer to 300. 25 soldiers died, mostly from friendly fire. They were shooting so indiscriminately they hit their own men. The bodies of my ancestors were left in the snow for 3 days, frozen in positions of flight, of protection, of prayer. Then they were dumped in a mass grave, a long trench dug into the South Dakota earth. A monument was eventually erected. Tours are given. People come, take pictures, leave, but the dead never left, and the massacre never ended. I was 5 years old during the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee, when members of the American Indian movement held the site for 71 days, demanding the government honors its treaties. My mother kept me inside our house in Pine Ridge Village 20 miles away, but I remember the helicopters, the gunfire, the fear and excitement that change was finally coming. I remember my grandmother, Lucy Crow Dog, telling me something that made no sense at the time. "They're not just fighting for the future," she said, holding me as we watched the smoke rise in the distance. "They're fighting the past. The past that's still happening." I thought it was just the way elders talk, in riddles and metaphors. I wouldn't understand what she literally meant until 36 years later. December 29th, 2009. My first year being assigned to the Wounded Knee site for the anniversary. The other officers called it the easy shift. Stand around, make sure drunk teenagers don't vandalize anything. Be visible, but respectful. The ceremonies would happen during the day. People would leave flowers and sage, and by evening, everyone would be gone. I arrived at 3 a.m. to do a preliminary sweep. The monument stood silent in my headlights, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The temperature was 15 below, typical for December in South Dakota. I parked my patrol vehicle and got out, my breath forming ice crystals in the air. At 3:30 a.m., something changed. The temperature rose 20 degrees in less than a minute. The frozen ground began to steam, and I heard them. Voices speaking Lakota, not modern Lakota, but the old dialect, the one my great-grandmother used. They were singing, praying, crying out in fear. At 3:45 a.m., the ground began to crack. Not from frost or seismic activity, but in perfect straight lines forming a rectangle exactly where the mass grave had been dug. A smell rose from the cracks, gunpowder, blood, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. The smell of time itself rupturing. At 3:47 a.m., the bleeding began. It started as drops, seeping through the cracks like groundwater. But groundwater isn't warm. Groundwater doesn't have the iron smell of fresh blood. Groundwater doesn't carry the DNA of people who died 119 years ago. I know because I've had it tested, illegally, at a private lab in Rapid City. The results showed genetic markers from multiple individuals, all consistent with late 19th century Lakota populations, all showing signs of massive trauma. I stood there, frozen not by cold but by impossibility, as the blood pooled and spread. It flowed uphill, defying gravity, forming patterns I recognized from old photographs, the exact positions where bodies had fallen in 1890. For 17 minutes, Wounded Knee bled. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The cracks sealed themselves. The blood vanished, not absorbed into the ground, not evaporated, just gone. The temperature dropped back to 15 below zero, and I was left standing there wondering if I'd lost my mind. I didn't report it. Who would believe me? Instead, I came back the next night, and the next. Nothing happened. But when December 29, 2010, came around, I was ready with cameras, sample containers, and a digital thermometer. At 3:47 a.m., it happened again. Exactly the same. The ground bled, history repeated, and reality seemed to hiccup. This time, though, I saw them. Transparent figures like heat mirages in winter, moving across the killing field. Women clutching children. Men raising their hands in surrender. Soldiers firing rifles that made no sound but produced invisible impacts that I could somehow feel in my chest. I was watching the massacre happen, not a recording or a reenactment, but the actual event, occurring in the same space but in a different layer of time. One figure became solid enough that I could make out details. A young woman, maybe 20, in a ghost dance dress painted with stars and eagles. She was running toward me, carrying an infant, her face twisted in terror. She passed right through me, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, I felt what she felt. The cold, the fear, the incomprehension that the soldiers were actually firing on women and children. The desperate need to save her baby. The impact of the bullet that would kill them both. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, tears freezing on my face before they could fall. When I looked up, she was gone. They were all gone. But the blood remained for another 10 minutes before vanishing. That's when I knew this wasn't just a haunting. Hauntings are echoes of the past. This was the past itself, still happening, trapped in a loop that repeated every year like a broken record of reality. I started researching, carefully, quietly. I found references in Army reports from the 1890s about temporal distortions at Wounded Knee. I discovered that the 7th Cavalry's commander, Colonel James Forsyth, had written in his private journal about strange dreams where the battle never ends until his death by suicide in 1906. I learned that every December 29th since 1890, something had been reported at the site. Unexplained sounds, phantom lights, sudden temperature changes, but it had all been dismissed as folklore or misidentification. Then I found the classified files. It was 2011, and I was dating a woman who worked at the Ellsworth Air Force Base. She had clearance for historical archives, and one night, after too many drinks, she showed me something she shouldn't have. A folder marked Project Ghost Dance, Temporal Anomaly Research, 1973 to present. According to the documents, the government had known about the temporal instability at Wounded Knee since at least 1973. During the occupation, when AIM activists held the site, military surveillance equipment had detected what they called chronological phase shifts. They had photographs of people who shouldn't exist, Lakota warriors from the 1890s standing next to 1970s activists, all in the same frame, all equally real. The files contained transcripts of interviews with soldiers from 1973 who claimed to have engaged in firefights with hostiles in period dress, who vanished upon being shot, but whose bullets were real enough to wound and kill. There were soil analyses showing isotopes that shouldn't exist in nature, radiation signatures that suggested space-time distortion, and mathematical models that hurt to look at, equations that seemed to prove that Wounded Knee existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously occurring in multiple time frames. But the most disturbing document was a memo from 1974, signed by someone identified only as DK, stating, "The site must be contained but not interfered with. Any attempt to resolve the temporal paradox could result in cascading chronological failure. The past must be allowed to continue happening to prevent it from happening everywhere." I photographed everything I could before my girlfriend realized what she'd done and made me swear never to speak of it. We broke up soon after. She couldn't handle what she called my obsession with Wounded Knee, but I had what I needed. Proof that the government knew. Proof that something impossible was happening. Proof that the massacre wasn't history. It was current events, recurring endlessly in a temporal prison. In 2012, I met Dr. Sarah Stanzen-Timber, a quantum physicist from the University of Chicago who was also Cheyenne. She had been working on a theory about consciousness and time, specifically how traumatic events could create what she called temporal scarring, wounds in space-time that never heal. "Think of it like PTSD for the universe itself," she explained when I showed her my evidence. "An event so traumatic, so wrong, that reality can't process it. So it keeps trying to resolve it, playing it over and over, hoping for a different outcome that never comes." She came with me that December 29th. She brought equipment, magnetometers, Geiger counters, devices I didn't recognize. At 3:47 a.m., when the bleeding began, her instruments went crazy. She recorded electromagnetic fluctuations that shouldn't be possible, gravitational anomalies that suggested mass that wasn't there, and most impossibly tachyon particles, theoretical particles that move backward in time. "It's not just repeating," she said, her face pale in the light of her laptop screen. "It's still happening for the first time. Past, present, and future are collapsed into a single moment that extends forever. Those people aren't dead, they're dying, continuously, eternally. That's when we heard the drums. They started soft, distant, like an echo of an echo, but they grew louder, more insistent. Ghost dance drums, playing the rhythm that was supposed to make the white world disappear, supposed to bring back the buffalo and the dead. The rhythm that had so terrified the government in 1890 that they sent the 7th Cavalry to stop it. Sarah's equipment detected something else, a signal encoded in the drum beats. It was mathematical, deliberate. When she ran it through her computers, it produced an image that made us both gasp. It was a star map, but not of our sky. It showed constellations that didn't exist, arranged around a central point that, when we checked, corresponded exactly to the location of Wounded Knee. And at the bottom, in Lakota stellar calendar notation that only a handful of scholars could read, was a date. December 29th, 2025. "What happens in 2025? I asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, running calculations. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. According to this, that's when the loop completes its first full cycle. That's when the past, present, and future converge completely. When everyone who died at Wounded Knee returns. Returns? The ghost dance, she whispered. It wasn't a failed prophecy. It was a delayed one. The dancers believed they could bring back the dead, make the white world disappear, but they got the mechanism wrong. It wasn't magic. It was temporal manipulation. And it worked. It just takes 135 years to complete. Before we could discuss it further, a black SUV pulled up. Federal agents, but not FBI. They wore no identifying badges, moved with military precision, and their leader, a woman with silver hair and ancient eyes, looked at us with something between pity and resignation. "Dr. Stanson Timber, Officer Crow Dog," she said. "You need to come with us. There are things about Wounded Knee you don't understand. Things that, if released, could unravel not just history, but causality itself." We had no choice but to go with them. As we drove away, I looked back at Wounded Knee. In the pre-dawn darkness, I could see them, hundreds of ghostly figures, Lakota and cavalry, locked in eternal combat, eternal death, eternal return. And above them, the stars were moving, rearranging themselves into patterns that matched Sarah's impossible map. The countdown to 2025 had begun, and with it, the possibility that the ghost dance prophecy, the return of the dead and the disappearance of the white world, might actually come true. Not through magic, but through the universe's attempt to heal a wound that won't stop bleeding. The black SUV took us to a facility I didn't know existed, an underground complex beneath Badlands National Park, about 50 miles from Pine Ridge. The entrance was hidden in what looked like a park maintenance building, but the elevator went down for what felt like minutes. When the doors opened, we stepped into a world of impossible technology and impossible truths. The woman with silver hair introduced herself as Director Catherine Marsh of the Temporal Anomaly Response Division, TARD, a branch of the government so classified that most of the government didn't know it existed. "Welcome to Looking Glass Station," she said, leading us through corridors lined with monitors showing various locations across America. Each screen was labeled with coordinates and a temporal stability index. Wounded Knee's monitor showed a pulsing red alert. TSI, 12.7% and falling. "We've been monitoring chronologically unstable sites since 1943, Marsh explained. The Manhattan Project didn't just split the atom, it cracked time itself in several locations. Most heal naturally. But some, like Wounded Knee, are infected by what we call causal trauma. Events so significant, so wrong, that they create permanent wounds in space-time." She brought us to a conference room where the walls were covered with documents, photographs, and equations. I recognized some from the classified files I'd seen, but most were new. There were daguerreotypes from the 1890s showing the same transparent figures I'd witnessed. There were reports from every December 29th since the massacre, documenting escalating anomalies. "The ghost dance wasn't just a religious movement," Marsh continued. "The prophet Wovoka had visions, yes, but what he saw wasn't spiritual, it was temporal. He perceived the quantum nature of reality, the possibility that consciousness could affect time itself. The ghost dance was essentially a ritual designed to create a temporal paradox massive enough to rewrite history." Dr. Stanson Timber leaned forward. "You're saying they were trying to create a time loop?" "Not create," Marsh corrected. "Activate. The loop was always there, potential energy waiting to be triggered. The massacre at Wounded Knee provided the emotional trauma, the blood sacrifice, if you will, to initiate the process. but it's taken 135 years for the loop to charge fully. She pulled up a holographic display, technology that shouldn't exist, showing Wounded Knee as a three-dimensional model with time as the fourth dimension. The massacre appeared as a dark knot, with threads extending in all directions. Every December 29th, the loop gets stronger. The boundary between 1890 and now gets thinner. We've calculated that on December 29th, 2025, the barrier will collapse entirely. The past and present will merge. What does that mean? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Marsh's expression was grim. Best case scenario? Everyone who died at Wounded Knee returns to life, creating a paradox that collapses this timeline and creates a new one where the massacre never happened. Worst case? The temporal rupture spreads, unraveling causality across the continent. Time itself becomes nonlinear. Past, present, and future all happen simultaneously. Human consciousness can't survive that. Society would collapse within hours. She showed us video footage from December 29th, 2023, just a few weeks ago. The bleeding ground was worse than I'd ever seen it, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. The transparent figures were more solid, and some of them were looking directly at the camera. One soldier was writing something in a notebook. When the image was enhanced, we could read it. Help us. We can't stop. It never ends. December 29th forever. God forgive us. They're becoming aware, Sarah whispered. The people in the loop are developing consciousness of their situation. It gets worse, Marsh said. She pulled up another file, a photograph from 1973. It showed the Wounded Knee occupation, but in the background, clearly visible, were 7th Cavalry soldiers from 1890. During the occupation, several AIM members reported speaking with Lakota warriors from the original massacre. They thought it was peyote visions or stress hallucinations. But we have recordings. She played an audio file. Through the static, I could hear voices speaking Lakota, not modern Lakota, but the dialect from the 1890s. They were warning about something, repeating the same phrase over and over. Sarah translated. The dance must complete. The circle must close. The children must return. Children? I asked. Marsh pulled up genealogical records. This is where it gets personal, Officer Crow Dog. Your great-great-grandmother, Mary Crow Dog, was 8 years old at Wounded Knee. She survived by hiding under her mother's body. But according to these temporal scans, she also died. She exists in quantum superposition, both alive and dead, both your ancestor and one of the returning spirits. I felt the world spin. That's impossible. So is bleeding ground and transparent soldiers, Marsh replied. At Wounded Knee, impossible is normal. And you, Officer Crow Dog, carry the genetic markers of someone who both survived and died in the massacre. You're a living paradox, which is why you can see things others can't. She turned to Sarah. And you, Dr. Stanson Timber, your equations about consciousness and time, they're not theoretical. You've been unconsciously documenting what's happening at Wounded Knee. Your Cheyenne ancestry connects you to this as well. Your people were allied with the Lakota. Some of them died at Wounded Knee too. So what do you want from us? Sarah asked. We need to prevent the final convergence, Marsh said. We've tried everything. Electromagnetic pulses, quantum stabilizers, even a small tactical nuke in 1981 that we covered up as an earthquake. Nothing works. The loop is self-sustaining now, feeding on its own temporal energy. But your research, Dr. Stanson Timber, suggests another approach. Sarah's eyes widened. You want to complete the ghost dance. Not complete, Marsh corrected. Redirect, if we can't stop the loop, maybe we can change its destination. Instead of merging 1890 with 2025, we create a third option, a parallel timeline where both events can exist without destroying causality. A temporal refugee dimension. Sarah breathed. A place where the dead can exist without paradox. Exactly. But it requires someone with a foot in both timelines to serve as an anchor. Someone who exists in the superposition between life and death, past and present. She looked directly at me. Someone like you, Officer Crow Dog. Before I could respond, alarms began blaring. Every monitor in the facility turned red. A technician rushed in, panic in his eyes. Director, we have a level 5 temporal incursion at Wounded Knee. The site it's manifesting outside of December 29th. We rushed to the control room. On the main screen, we could see Wounded Knee in real time. It was January 15th, 2024, middle of the day, tourists present. But the massacre was happening. Transparent 7th Cavalry soldiers were firing through confused tourists. Blood was seeping from ground that shouldn't bleed for another 11 months. The timeline is accelerating, Marsh said. We're out of time. The convergence isn't waiting until 2025. It's starting now. That's when I heard it. My grandmother Lucy's voice. Impossible since she died in 2010, but it was coming from the speakers, from Wounded Knee itself. Robert, she said in Lakota, the dancers are ready. The circle is forming. You must choose, join the dance or break the drum. But know this, both choices have been made before, will be made again, are being made now. Time is a circle, grandson, and Wounded Knee is its center. The feed cut to static, then resolved into something impossible. It showed Wounded Knee, but not as it was. Instead, we saw multiple versions of it overlapping. The 1890 massacre, the 1973 occupation, the present day, and something else. A future version where massive crystalline structures rose from the earth, where people in clothing I didn't recognize performed ceremonies with technology that looked like magic. What are we looking at? I asked. Sarah was running calculations on her tablet, her face growing paler with each result. It's not a temporal anomaly anymore. Wounded Knee has become a temporal nexus, a point where all timelines converge. Every possible version of history is becoming real there simultaneously. Marsh made a decision. We're going in. Prep a field team. Full temporal shielding. We need to get to the site before... She never finished the sentence. The lights went out, and when emergency power kicked in, we weren't alone in the control room. Standing among us were 3 figures I recognized from historical photographs. Sitting Bull, who had been killed 2 weeks before Wounded Knee, Bigfoot, who died in the massacre, and someone else, a young woman in a ghost dance dress, the same one I'd seen bleeding through time. But they weren't transparent. They were solid, real, standing in our underground facility in 2024. Sitting Bull spoke, and his words came out in perfect English despite his lips moving in Lakota. The dance has begun. The veil is torn. What was separated is becoming one. You cannot stop it, but you can guide it. The choice has always been the same. Honor the dead or join them. The young woman stepped forward, and I recognized her fully now. It was Mary Crow Dog, my great-great-grandmother, not as the elderly woman I'd seen in photographs, but as she would have been if she'd lived past 8 years old. You carry my blood, she said to me. Blood that lived and blood that died. You are the bridge between what was and what might be. The ghost dance isn't about bringing back the dead, grandson. It's about healing the wound between life and death, between then and now. Bigfoot, The chief, who had led his people to Wounded Knee, seeking protection only to be massacred, raised his hand. Where he pointed, the air itself began to crack like broken glass. Through the cracks we could see Wounded Knee, not on a monitor, but actually there, as if space had folded to bring it to us. "Come," he said. "See what your government has hidden. See what the earth remembers. See why the ground bleeds. Against all protocol, against all reason." We followed. We stepped through the crack in reality and found ourselves standing at Wounded Knee. But not the Wounded Knee I knew. This was every version of it at once. Snow-covered and summer green, full of tourists and completely empty, scene of a massacre and site of prayer, past and present and future collapsed into a single impossible moment. And there, in the center of it all, was something that made everything else make sense. A massive machine, partially buried, partially phased into another dimension. It was covered in military markings from the 1940s, but also symbols I recognized as Lakota stellar maps. It was ancient and brand new, broken and perfectly functional. "The time machine," Marsh gasped. "Project Kronos. It was real. Sarah was scanning it with her equipment. It's not from the 1940s. It's from the 1940s and the 1890s and 2025, and it exists across all timelines simultaneously. Someone built this to create the loop." "Not someone," Sitting Bull said. "Something, the earth itself, wounded by injustice, created this to heal. But healing requires reopening the wound. The massacre must happen again and again until it happens right." "Happens right?" I asked. "How can a massacre happen right?" "When it doesn't happen at all," Bigfoot answered. "When the choice that leads to it is unmade. When the dance completes and the timeline heals. December 29th, 1890 must become December 29th, 2025 must become never." The machine began to pulse with light, and I could feel it pulling at something inside me. The part that existed in superposition. The part that was both alive and dead. Sarah grabbed my hand, anchoring me. But I could feel myself beginning to phase, becoming like the transparent figures I'd witnessed for years. "The choice is yours, Robert Crow Dog," my great-great-great-grandmother said. "Activate the machine fully and merge all timelines, risking everything but possibly healing everything. Or destroy it and lock the wound forever, condemning the dead to eternal repetition but saving the living from temporal collapse." As she spoke, more figures materialized around us. The 300 who died at Wounded Knee, but also the soldiers who killed them, all looking at me with desperate hope and terrible fear. Behind them, I could see shadowy forms of millions more. Every Native American who had died from disease, war, and displacement, and beyond them, every human who had ever lived and died unjustly. This wasn't just about Wounded Knee. It never had been. It was about the fundamental wound in human history, the original sin of violence and conquest, playing out in an endless loop across time. "If I activate it," I asked, "what happens to the world?" Sarah had the answer, her voice shaking as she read from her calculations. "Everything changes. History rewrites itself from this point, not just erasing the massacre, but creating a timeline where the conditions for it never existed, where colonization happened differently or not at all, where humanity took another path. We don't know what that world looks like, but it won't be ours. And if I destroy it, then this continues forever. The bleeding ground, the temporal anomalies, the slow collapse of causality around traumatic events worldwide. Wounded Knee is just the first. Every massacre, every genocide, every great wrong will eventually create its own loop. Reality will become a prison of endless repetition. The machine pulsed again, and I heard something that made the choice for me. Children crying. Not just any children, the specific children who died at Wounded Knee. I could hear their names, their ages, their last words. I could feel their fear, their confusion as the soldiers fired into the crowd. I could sense their souls, trapped in that moment for 134 years, dying over and over, never able to rest. I thought of my own children, safe at home in Pine Ridge. I thought of all the children who might live or never exist, depending on my choice. I thought of my grandmother Lucy's words. They're not just fighting for the future. They're fighting the past. I stepped toward the machine. As I approached the machine, the world began to fracture. I could see myself from multiple angles simultaneously, as I was now, as my ancestors had been, as my descendants would be. The temporal nexus was showing me all possible versions of Robert Crow Dog across infinite timelines, and in every single one, I was making this same choice. "Wait!" Director Marsh shouted. "You don't understand the full implications." "Show him the files, all of them." She pulled out a device I'd never seen before, projecting holographic documents into the air around us. They weren't just government files. They were records from multiple timelines, each one showing a different version of history. "We've been through this before," she said. "Not us specifically, but other versions of us. The loop has been activated 17 times across different temporal iterations. Each time, someone makes the choice to rewrite history. And each time, it fails. The documents showed horrific alternatives. Timelines where preventing Wounded Knee led to worse massacres. Where saving the Lakota resulted in nuclear war in the 1960s. Where every attempt to heal the past created darker futures. But those were partial activations, Sarah argued, studying the data. Look at the quantum signatures. They tried to change single events. Robert's different. He exists in superposition. He could activate it fully, change not just one event, but the entire causal chain. Bigfoot stepped forward, and as he did, his appearance shifted. One moment, he was the dying chief from 1890, the next, a warrior in his prime, then an elder teaching children, then all of these at once. Each time the machine activates, he said, it learns. It refines its approach. We are not the first to stand here, but we might be the last. The machine has been waiting for someone like you, Robert Crow Dog. Someone who carries both death and life, both past and future. Show me, I said. Show me what really happened. Not the history book version. The truth. The machine responded to my words, projecting the past directly into our minds. We were there. December 29th, 1890. But seeing it from every perspective simultaneously. I saw through the eyes of a 7th Cavalry soldier, hungover and freezing, scared of the Lakota and scared of his commanding officers. He didn't want to shoot, but when the firing started, muscle memory and fear took over. I felt his horror as he realized they were killing children, his desperate attempts to stop his fellow soldiers, and his lifetime of nightmares afterward. I saw through the eyes of a Lakota mother, trying to shield her baby, praying to Wakantanka that this was a mistake, that the soldiers would stop. I felt her last thought, not hatred for her killers, but desperate love for her child and confusion that humans could do this to each other. I saw through the eyes of Bigfoot, dying of pneumonia, trying to surrender peacefully, watching his people cut down around him. His last prayer wasn't for vengeance but for understanding, that someday, somehow, both peoples would learn to see each other as human. And I saw something else, someone else, a figure that didn't belong in 1890, working with the machine, ensuring the massacre happened exactly as history recorded. They wore military insignia from no nation I recognized, and their face kept shifting. Sometimes human, sometimes something else. "The temporal authority," Marsh whispered. "They're real." "Who?" I demanded. "Humans from a possible future, one where time travel exists but is regulated by a fascist government. They ensure traumatic events happen as scheduled to maintain their timeline. They've been sabotaging every attempt to heal the loop." As if summoned by her words, 3 figures materialized. They wore black uniforms with insignia that hurt to look at, symbols that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Their faces were human but wrong, as if they'd been edited by someone who didn't quite understand human features. "Officer Crow Dog," their leader said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You will cease this activation immediately. The timeline must be preserved. The massacre at Wounded Knee is a fixed point. Without it, our civilization never develops the technology to prevent the greater massacre of 2847. "Greater massacre?" Sarah asked. 12 billion humans killed when first contact goes wrong. Only by studying the quantum effects of historical traumas like Wounded Knee do we develop the temporal shields necessary to survive. Every death here saves millions in our time. "You're lying," I said, feeling the truth through my connection to the machine. "I can see your timeline. You don't prevent any massacre, you cause it. You've turned all of human history into a farm for temporal energy, feeding off our suffering." The leader's face flickered, revealing something underneath that wasn't human at all. "Irrelevant. You will comply or be erased from all timelines." They raised weapons that looked like crystallized mathematics, aimed at us. But before they could fire, the ghost dancers acted. They came from everywhere. Not just the 300 from Wounded Knee, but thousands of native spirits from across history. They surrounded the temporal authority agents, and where they touched them, the agents began to discorporate, their stolen time energy returning to its source. "You made one mistake," Sitting Bull said to the agents. "You thought the dead were powerless. But we've been gathering strength for 134 years, existing in every moment of the loop simultaneously. We are not ghosts. We are the immune system of time itself." The leader tried to escape, phasing through dimensions, but Mary Crow Dog, my impossible great-great-grandmother who was both 8 and 80, caught him with hands that existed in multiple timelines. "You fed on our deaths," she said. "Now feed on our lives." She didn't kill him. Instead, she showed him every life cut short at Wounded Knee, made him experience their entire unlived existence. Every joy they never had, every child they never bore, every sunset they never saw. The agent screamed, not in pain, but in overwhelming empathy, feeling for the first time the weight of what had been stolen. When she released him, he fell to his knees, no longer the temporal fascist, but a broken man, overwhelmed by understanding. "Activate it," he gasped. "Please. I've seen what we took from them, from you, from everyone. End this, and all of it. Give them back their lives, even if it costs us our timeline." But the machine was already responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. It wasn't waiting for my decision. It was feeding on the collective will of everyone present. The living, the dead, even the temporal authority agents who were beginning to understand the horror of their actions. Sarah's equipment went haywire. "Robert, the machine isn't just activating. It's evolving. It's becoming something new." The crystalline structure began to grow, spreading across Wounded Knee like a living thing. Where it touched the ground, the blood stopped seeping. Where it reached the air, the transparent figures became solid. But they weren't returning to life in our timeline. They were creating their own. I watched in awe as parallel realities began to form, visible as layers of existence stacked on top of each other. In one, the massacre never happened. The 7th Cavalry and Bigfoot's band shared a meal instead of bullets. The ghost dance continued peacefully. and history took a different path. In another, the massacre happened but was immediately recognized as a crime, with soldiers tried for murder and the government paying true reparations. In yet another, European colonization never reached the Great Plains, and the Lakota developed their own technological civilization. It's not choosing one timeline, Sarah breathed. It's creating a multiverse where every possibility exists. But Director Marsh saw the danger. If all timelines become real simultaneously, which one do we exist in? Where do we go? That's when I understood my true purpose. I wasn't meant to choose which timeline survived. I was meant to help people choose which timeline they wanted to exist in. As someone who existed in superposition, I could guide others through the transition. Everyone gets to choose, I announced, feeling the machine respond to my words. Every soul touched by this tragedy, living or dead, gets to choose their timeline. Stay in this one with its pain, but also its growth, or move to one where things happened differently. The reaction was immediate. Some of the ghost dancers chose to fade into timelines where they'd never died. Others chose to remain as guardians between worlds. Some of the cavalry soldiers, overwhelmed by guilt, chose timelines where they could make amends. Others chose to face justice. But the most surprising choice came from Bigfoot himself. "I choose all of them," he said. "Let me exist in every timeline, dying in some, living in others, but always working for peace. Let my story be both warning and hope, tragedy and triumph. Let Wounded Knee be not a single wound, but infinite possibilities for healing." The machine responded to his sacrifice, because that's what it was, choosing to experience both suffering and joy across infinite realities. The crystalline structure exploded into light, not destructive but transformative, spreading from Wounded Knee across the planet. Everywhere that historical trauma had occurred, the light touched and offered the same choice. The Holocaust, slavery, every genocide and massacre, all their victims were given the option to exist in timelines where they'd survived, while still maintaining the timeline where their deaths served as warnings to humanity. But the light did more than offer choices. It made the borders between timelines permeable. People could see into other realities, learn from versions of history that had gone differently. Racism became harder to maintain when you could literally see timelines where racial harmony had prevailed. War became harder to justify when you could witness realities where conflicts had been resolved peacefully. Not everyone could handle it. Some people's minds broke trying to process infinite realities. Others retreated into denial, insisting only their timeline was real. But many, especially the young, adapted. They learned to think in multiple dimensions, to consider all possibilities before acting. The temporal authority agents were the most affected. With their timeline-hopping technology, they experienced all realities simultaneously. Their leader, still kneeling where Mary had released him, began to age rapidly, not physically but spiritually, experiencing every moment of suffering they'd preserved and every moment of joy they'd prevented. "We were wrong," he said, his voice echoing across dimensions. "We thought we were gardeners, pruning history for the best outcome. But we were parasites, feeding on fixed points of pain. The timeline doesn't need preservation. It needs the freedom to heal." He stood, and his fellow agents gathered around him. Together, they began to dissolve. Not dying, but distributing their accumulated temporal energy back to all the moments they'd stolen it from. As they faded, history itself became more fluid, more capable of change and growth. But we still had a problem. The machine, having completed its purpose, was beginning to collapse, and its collapse threatened to either lock the timelines apart forever or merge them catastrophically. "Someone needs to stabilize it manually," Sarah said, checking her calculations. Someone needs to become a permanent bridge between realities. I knew what she meant. I had known since the moment I first saw the bleeding ground. This had always been my purpose, my destination. I was born in superposition for this moment. "I'll do it," I said. "No," my great-great-grandmother Mary said. "We'll do it." She gestured, and I saw them, hundreds of crow dogs across the generations, all existing in quantum superposition between life and death, all connected by blood and choice. My grandmother Lucy was there, young and old, simultaneously. My mother, my children, even descendants not yet born. "The crow dog family has always walked between worlds," Lucy said. "It's our gift and our burden. Let us share it." Together, we joined hands around the collapsing machine. I felt our consciousness merge and expand, becoming something larger than individual identity. We became the bridge itself, the living connection between all possible timelines. The sensation was overwhelming. I could feel every version of reality simultaneously: the pain of the massacre, the joy of survival, the confusion of timelines where Native Americans colonized Europe, the peace of realities where humanity never developed at all. But through it all, I maintained my core self, anchored by my family's presence across time. The machine stabilized, transforming from a crystalline structure into something organic, almost alive. It sank into the earth at Wounded Knee, but also rose into the sky, existing in multiple states simultaneously. It became what Sarah would later call a temporal tree: roots in the past, branches in the future, and a trunk firmly planted in the eternal present. As the transformation completed, I found myself standing back in normal reality, or what passed for normal now. The bleeding had stopped permanently. The transparent figures were gone, having chosen their timelines. Wounded Knee looked like an ordinary historical site, except for the shimmer in the air that suggested other realities just out of sight. Director Marsh was checking her equipment, trying to understand what had happened. Temporal stability at... This doesn't make sense. It's showing both 0% and 100% simultaneously. "That's because stability isn't the goal anymore," Sarah explained. "The timeline isn't stable or unstable. It's fluid, capable of change without breaking. The temporal authority leader, who should have dissolved completely, existed as a shadow of possibility. What happens to us now?" he asked. "We built our entire civilization on controlling time. Now you learn to surf it instead," I said, feeling the wisdom of countless crow dogs speaking through me. "Time isn't a river to be dammed or a garden to be pruned. It's an ocean, and we're all just learning to swim. It's been 1 year since the convergence, as historians are calling it now. Though historians isn't quite the right word anymore. They're more like dimensional cartographers, mapping the infinite branches of human possibility that sprawl from every moment. I'm still Robert Crow Dog, still technically an Oglala Lakota Tribal Police investigator, but my jurisdiction has expanded beyond anything that fits on a badge. I investigate crimes across timelines, mediate disputes between versions of the same person, and help lost souls find their way home to whatever reality they choose to call home. Wounded Knee has become the unofficial capital of the New World, or should I say worlds. The site exists simultaneously in every timeline now, a constant that anchors the multiverse. The monument is different depending on which reality you're tuned to. In some, it commemorates a massacre. In others, it celebrates a peace treaty. In a few, it marks humanity's first successful temporal experiment. The tourist experience has certainly changed. People come from around the world, and from other versions of the world, to witness the place where linear time ended and something stranger began. We've had to install what Sarah calls reality filters at the entrance, specialized devices that help visitors' minds process what they're seeing without going insane. Welcome to Wounded Knee, I tell a group of visitors from what we call Timeline Prime, our original reality. Please keep your perception anchored to your home timeline unless you're accompanied by a licensed phase guide. The gift shop exists in all realities simultaneously, but prices may vary based on your dimensional exchange rate. They laugh nervously, thinking it's a joke. They'll learn. Sarah Stanzen Timber has become the world's first professor of quantum anthropology at Harvard, though she also teaches at the Harvard that exists in the timeline where Native Americans founded it in 1636. She's developed a mathematical framework for understanding how consciousness navigates parallel realities, work that won her the Nobel Prize in 3 different timelines. The ghost dance worked, she told me last week over coffee that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Not the way Wovoka envisioned, but the fundamental promise was kept. The dead returned, the buffalo returned. They just returned in timelines where they never left. She's right. If you know how to look, if you adjust your perception just right, you can see them. The great herds thundering across plains that are both empty and full, both past and present. The ghost dancers still dance, but now their dance maintains the bridges between worlds instead of trying to change one world into another. Director Marsh retired, or tried to. Turns out, when you've been exposed to that much temporal radiation, you don't age linearly anymore. She exists as a quantum probability cloud, sometimes 30, sometimes 90, occasionally all ages at once. She's founded an organization called the Temporal Truth and Reconciliation Commission, dedicated to acknowledging and healing historical traumas across all timelines. We can't change the past, she says in her mission statement, which exists as a living document that updates itself across realities. But we can change our relationship with it. We can choose which version of the past we learn from. The governments plural, since there are now several versions of the United States existing in quantum superposition, have had to adapt. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was disbanded and replaced with the Department of Dimensional Sovereignty, which recognizes that native tribes exist as sovereign nations across multiple timelines simultaneously. Pine Ridge isn't just a reservation anymore, it's an interdimensional embassy. But not everyone has adjusted well to the new reality. There are groups, the linearists they call themselves, who refuse to acknowledge any timeline but their own. They wear special blinders that block out dimensional bleeds, take pills that suppress quantum consciousness, and lobby for a return to temporal fascism, as they call it. They're led by a man named Richard Sterling, a billionaire who lost his fortune when the timeline where he was poor started bleeding into his reality. "This is madness," he shouts at rallies that occur in carefully shielded venues. "We've destroyed causality itself. How can we build a future when the past keeps changing?" He's not entirely wrong. The world has become a much more complicated place. Murder trials are nearly impossible when the victim might be alive in another timeline. Elections are chaotic when voters can phase between realities to vote multiple times. The stock market crashed when traders realized they could see all possible futures simultaneously. But we're adapting. We're learning. Children born after the convergence are different. They see all timelines naturally, playing with friends who exist in different realities, learning history not as a sequence of events but as a web of possibilities. My daughter, Emma, is 7 now. Yesterday, I watched her playing with her grandmother, Lucy, both the version who died in 2010 and the version who lived to 2024. "Daddy," she asked me, "why do some people only see one world?" Because that's all they can handle, sweetheart, I told her. That's sad, she said, then went back to playing with toys that existed in 6 dimensions. The real challenge has been the bleed zones, places where timelines overlap so completely that reality becomes negotiable. Downtown Rapid City is one of them. Depending on which frequency you're tuned to, it's a thriving metropolis, a ghost town, or a forest that was never cleared. People have learned to navigate by consensus, agreeing on which version of reality to acknowledge at any given moment. Crime has evolved too. We've had to deal with probability thieves who steal things that might exist, timeline vandals who try to erase historical events they don't like, and identity pirates who kidnap alternate versions of people to steal their better lives. Last month, I arrested a man for murdering himself. He'd killed 6 alternate versions to consolidate their life insurance policies. But there have been beautiful moments, too. Families reunited with loved ones who died in their timeline but lived in others. Scientists collaborating with versions of themselves to solve problems from multiple angles. Artists creating works that exist in several dimensions simultaneously, each viewing revealing different aspects of the piece. The Lakota Nation has become a leader in the New World. Our culture always understood that time isn't linear, that the past, present, and future are interconnected. The concept of mitakuye oyasin, all my relations, has taken on new meaning when you can literally see your relations across infinite timelines. Chief David Crow Dog, no relation despite the name, addressed the United Nations, all 17 versions of it, last month. For centuries, Western civilization has tried to impose linear time on the world, tried to say there's only one history, one truth, one reality. Indigenous peoples always knew better. We knew that all things are connected, that time is a circle, that the dead walk with us. The convergence hasn't broken reality. It's revealed what reality always was. But perhaps the strangest development has been the discovery of timelines where the convergence never happened. Realities where I never investigated Wounded Knee, where the bleeding ground was just a legend, where time remains stubbornly linear. We call them the null zones, and they're growing. It turns out that our transformation of time created a kind of quantum immune response. Realities that reject the change are hardening, becoming more fixed, more resistant to temporal fluidity. It's creating a new kind of segregation, not between races or nations, but between those who embrace temporal complexity and those who refuse it. The temporal authority hasn't completely disappeared. The version of them that exists in our timeline cluster has reformed as the Temporal Peace Corps, helping realities adjust to the new paradigm. Their leader, who now goes by the name Marcus Tomorrow, works from an office that exists in yesterday, today, and tomorrow simultaneously. We were trying to prevent change, he told me during our last meeting, his form flickering between the fascist enforcer he was and the enlightened guide he's becoming. Now we're trying to help people navigate it. It's harder, but it's honest. The machine at Wounded Knee, what we now call the temporal tree, has become a pilgrimage site. People come from across the dimensional spectrum to touch it, to feel the pulse of all realities flowing through its quantum bark. Some claim it grants visions. Others say it answers questions. A few insist it's slowly developing consciousness. I know the truth. The tree isn't developing consciousness, it's reflecting ours. Every person who touches it adds their timeline to its infinite branches. It's becoming a living history of not just what was, but what could be, what should be, what might be. Last week, something extraordinary happened. The tree produced fruit, small, luminous objects that exist in multiple states simultaneously. When you eat one, you temporarily experience perfect temporal vision. You see all timelines, all possibilities, all consequences of every action. Most people can only handle a small bite before the overwhelming nature of infinite possibility forces them to stop. But I ate a whole one. For 17 minutes, I existed as every possible version of Robert Crow Dog across every timeline. I was the version who became President of the Reformed United States. I was the version who died at 3 from smallpox. I was the version who never existed because my parents never met. I was the version who became a temporal terrorist, trying to collapse all timelines into one. I was the version who achieved enlightenment and ascended to pure consciousness. But most importantly, I was the version who stood at Wounded Knee and chose not to choose, who recognized that the power wasn't in selecting one timeline over another, but in allowing all timelines to coexist. When the vision ended, I understood something crucial. The convergence isn't complete, it's just beginning. The bleeding ground at Wounded Knee was never just about that one massacre. It was about every injustice, every trauma, every moment when humanity failed itself. And now, all of those wounds are beginning to open, to bleed, to demand healing. Reports are coming in from around the world. Auschwitz is phasing between realities. Hiroshima exists simultaneously destroyed and whole. Every slave port, every killing field, every site of human cruelty is beginning to exhibit temporal instability. But so are the sites of human triumph. Selma is cycling through infinite versions of the Civil Rights March. The Berlin Wall is falling and standing and never built all at once. Every moment of human courage and compassion is also becoming fluid, accessible, shareable across realities. Sarah thinks we're approaching what she calls the Omega Point, a moment when all human history becomes simultaneously accessible to all human consciousness, when everyone will have to confront not just their own past, but every possible version of it. We're going to have to choose, she says, not which timeline to live in, but how to live with all timelines. How to be human when humanity includes every possible version of itself. The government has assigned me to lead a new task force, the Temporal Integration Initiative. Our job is to help humanity prepare for what's coming. We're developing protocols for timeline refugees, creating support groups for people experiencing alternate identity syndrome, and establishing safe zones where reality remains relatively stable for those who need a break from infinite possibility. But honestly, I don't think we can prepare. Not really. You can't prepare for the moment when you meet the version of yourself who made all the right choices, or the one who made all the wrong ones. You can't prepare for dinner with the grandparents who died before you were born in your timeline but lived to meet you in another. You can't prepare for a world where death is negotiable, where history is fluid, where identity itself becomes a choice rather than a fact. My grandmother, Lucy, the version who lived to see the convergence, sits with me sometimes at Wounded Knee. We watch the sun set in 17 different ways, see the stars arrange themselves into constellations from timelines where different mythologies became true. "Are you afraid?" she asks me. Terrified, I admit, but also excited. For the first time in human history, we get to consciously choose not just our future, but our past. We get to heal wounds we thought were permanent. We get to become everything we could have been. And the cost? We lose the comfort of certainty. We lose the ability to say, "This is how things are," instead of, "This is how things could be." We lose the privilege of forgetting our failures by being forced to see the timelines where we succeeded. She nods, her form shifting between young and old, living and dead. The ghost dance worked, grandson. Just took longer than we thought. The world did end. The white world, the native world, all the separate worlds. They ended so that one world with infinite possibilities could begin. As I stand here at Wounded Knee, watching tourists from 17 different timelines take photos of monuments that exist and don't exist, I realize that December 29th isn't special anymore. Every day is December 29th now. Every day, somewhere in the quantum foam, the massacre is happening, not happening, being prevented, being redeemed. The ground doesn't bleed anymore because the wound has become a doorway. The past isn't past, the future isn't fixed, and the present is just one note in an infinite symphony of possibility. Welcome to the new world, all of them. If you're watching this from a timeline where the convergence hasn't happened yet, know this: it's coming. The wounds in time are opening everywhere, and soon you'll have to choose. Not whether to accept it, it's not optional, but how to navigate it. How to maintain your sanity, your identity, your humanity when faced with infinite versions of yourself and everyone you know. My advice: let go of the idea that there's one true timeline. Embrace the paradox. Learn to love yourself in all your versions. Forgive yourself for all your failures. Celebrate all your triumphs across all realities. And if you ever find yourself at Wounded Knee, standing where the ground once bled, where reality learned to heal itself through multiplicity rather than singularity, remember this: you're not just witnessing history. You're witnessing all possible histories, happening now, happening always, happening never. The ghost dance never ended. It just became the only dance there is, the infinite spiral of possibility that we're all part of, whether we know it or not. This is Robert Crowdog, signing off from everywhere and nowhere from the Wounded Knee that exists in all times and no time. See you in another timeline. In fact, I already have.